In February of 2020, the United States, under the previous administration, signed a peace deal with the Taliban, which would see the withdrawal of all U.s. troops by May of 2021. In April of 2021, the Biden administration announced the troops would withdraw completely by the 20th anniversary of 9/11. This would later be changed to 31 August. The last U.S. service member left on 30 August. Over the past several weeks, we have seen the astonishing success of the Taliban as they have managed to take almost complete control of the country. In scenes reminiscent of the fall of Saigon in 1975, helicopters evacuated diplomats and others from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. It seems what has been called the longest war in U.S. history has come to an inglorious end, with those on the left and the right taking potshots at the other side, allies blaming each other and denouncing each other's policies, and even those within the military questioning their own capabilities and what blame they have for the fall. Therefore, it's rather appropriate to review Ahmed Rashid's Descent into Chaos, how the war against Islamic extremism is being lost in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. In trying to look back at what went right and wrong in the United States war on terror, it helps to reach back to a review of the early portion of the conflict. Ahmed Rashid's published this book in 2008, some 13 years ago and 7 years into the conflict. This gives us an interesting chance to reflect on 3 historical points: the beginning of the conflict, roughly halfway through the conflict, and with the withdrawal of all troops amidst the fall of the Afghan government, the end of the conflict. Looking at these points, we can construct an assessment of the United States and other Western powers' efforts against radical Islamic extremism and the structure and conclusions presented in Descent into Chaos. The author states he did not mean his book to be a reappraisal of events years after they occurred, but an attempt to define history as it occurred without delving into the whys and wherefores of the causes of the conflict. He bases his autobiographical assessment on the fact he was personally present at many of the events occurring in the book and conducted first-hand interviews with the participants at many of the other events. As such, we can assume that we have a relatively accurate first-hand source, akin to letters and archival footages from other eras. However, we need to be as careful to make sure we take into account the personal biases of the author, both in favor of and against certain aspects of the story he is telling us. There's also something we need to remember when regarding other primary source material. The soldiers at Antietam, the war correspondent filming the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, or the flag raising on Iwo Jima, or the liberation of Baghdad, all had a story they were trying to tell, and a point they were attempting to get across to their viewers or to their readers. Ahmed Rashid makes it plain he considers the United States had wasted its opportunity to make a truly significant impact on the fortune of those in Central Asia. The Bush administration was not alone in squandering this opportunity, and he lays equal blame at the feet of then President of Pakistan, Pervez Musharraf, and the eventual first president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. There's plenty of blame left over, Rashid states, for the rest of the coalition and NATO forces involved in the initial war and subsequent operations. Equally, some responsibility for the present situation rests with the other countries in the stands, as they are collectively known, and the greater international community, as they failed to grasp the unique moment of history they occupied, according to Rashid. Now, we need to review some basic questions and assumptions. Those assumptions include how this conflict and the occupation of Afghanistan rate in length and expense to other conflicts with which the United States has been involved. In other words, has the blood and treasure expended by the United States and its coalition allies in this conflict truly been wasted? Is it possible that the United States and NATO forces' use of different tactics or strategic goals would have changed the situation on the ground in Afghanistan in 2021? It's undoubtedly true that the United States and its coalition and NATO allies were not prepared for the extended combat in which they found themselves in Afghanistan. Despite the amazing success and accomplishments in the primary ground war, which led to the initial collapse of the Taliban regime, the United States was not in a position to conduct long-term counterinsurgency operations. It didn't even have a manual to train its officers and men on how to conduct counterinsurgency operations until 2006. The shift in focus, goal, personnel, and material to Iraq soon after the invasion was completed was a further hindrance to coherent operations in Central Asia as the United States turned to the Middle East. However, the situation in both Iraq and Afghanistan were relatively new and unique, unlike any other insurgency encountered by a major power before. Even the United Kingdom, with a long history in India, Malaysia, and Northern Ireland, was ill prepared to counter this type of combat. Although keeping focus on Afghanistan would most likely have bolstered the fortunes of combat, it is still debatable if the tactics themselves were effective, or if the coalition applied them as effectively as possible. You have to remember the primary goal of the invasion of Afghanistan was to dismantle Al Qaeda and capture or kill Osama bin Laden. Despite the propensity of scorn by many for how the United States has conducted itself over the last 20 years, few people at the time could find fault with going after Al Qaeda. Even looking back to critique the situation now, most likely wouldn't find fault in going after an organization which caused one of the greatest losses of American life in a single attack since the opening days of World War II. We should always remember that Al Qaeda killed 2,996 people on that fateful day, with some 2,606 in the World Trade Center alone. This is the single worst act of terrorism ever carried out, and hopefully only ever to be surpassed by the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in deaths by a single act. Now, any loss of life is tragic. However, never think that committing yourself to eliminate this kind of threat at the cost of your own life is a waste of your life. It should also be noted the total loss of life at 2,313 for the United States and 3,459 for all coalition forces. Now, this is significantly below the 58,209 in the Vietnam War, 364,511 in the American Civil War, or the 405,399 in World War II. Equally, the cost of this conflict thus far, at an estimated $2.26 trillion, does not equal the $4 trillion spent in World War II, although it is double the estimated $1 trillion in Vietnam. And penultimately, we should discuss if this is the longest war in United States history. Now, Afghanistan has definitely outlasted all the wars the United States has fought. It has lasted longer than World War II and the American Revolution, much longer than the War of 1812 and the length of time the United States was involved in World War I. Additionally, the United States had troops on the ground and was involved in Vietnam from 1955 until 1975, making Vietnam just slightly shorter than Afghanistan at this time. You can see, however, the conflict in a greater context if you look at it from the perspective of nation building. And I'm sorry if you say the United States doesn't do nation building, then you're forgetting the Spanish-American War, World Wars I and II, as well as the Korean War. It is not that long at all. The United States still has bases and personnel in Europe and Asia. I personally know people born on those bases who are now serving on them with their own children. The fact that we are now coming up on the second generation serving in Afghanistan, when viewed in that context, is normal. The main and final thing we need to review is the primary argument of the book, that the United States has wasted an opportunity to radically alter the fate of Central Asia and bring it into the modern company of nations. That America had the chance to break the cycle of corruption and violence plaguing the region. Now, this assumes, of course, that it was the United States' place to make the change at all. And as the sole superpower at the time, the United States may have been able to utilize its hard and soft power to better affect and change how its allies, both in Afghanistan and in the greater international community, behaved and reacted to the situation in Afghanistan. However, this meant it was the United States' responsibility to make those changes in the first place. Afghanistan has been a mess politically, economically, and culturally since the time of Alexander the Great. This was where arguably the greatest general of all time was stopped and unable to enforce his will. Why should we assume the United States would fare any better, or even make the attempt? Well, Rashid does lay some of the blame for the debacle on the people of Afghanistan. He lays a majority on the international community and the actions of the United States. Now, if the local population is unwilling to make the required sacrifice to ensure their own future, is the West not being arrogant and continuing the colonial activity it is so often accused of if it tries to force an arrangement on the populace? Perhaps a deeper look at the region's self-imposed issues, in addition to the advantage and misuse applied to it by outside forces, needs to take place. Ahmed Rashid did an admirable job chronicling the first half of the conflict in Afghanistan. His prose is succinct and readable. He spends enough time explaining the backstory and his personal affiliation with the story to allow us a reasonable certainty of his views and biases. The main area he fails is in the overwhelming assistance Afghanistan needs from the outside world, especially his native Pakistan and the United States, in order to correct the problems in the region. As we wait and see the final outcome of the Taliban takeover of the country, perhaps the people of the region will take the opportunity presented as the United States and other great powers focuses elsewhere to secure their own future, as opposed to having someone else secure it for them, and move towards a kind of peace at some point, hopefully in the near future.